We have someone, like I say, that we want to introduce to you, but they're rather indisposed right now. And what we're going to do tonight is that we talked about Black history all during the month of February. But one thing that we did not bring up was how it all began. How it all began. We have a video that we're going to be showing tonight that's going to tell a story of how Black folks were those that came to this country in bondage, because the truth be told, Black folks were already here, Pastor Thomas.
Yes, sir.
And at all corners of the earth. There's no nation that you can go to and not find a Black human existence there. And that includes what we call China and also Russia. And FYI to a lot of you folks out there that may not know, you are familiar when you with Russians as being rather European. Well, they are not the native people of that region known as Russia, And so, like I say, Black folks are represented in all areas of this earth, including throughout Rome. And so tonight we have a video that's going to tell about the North Atlantic slave trade. Okay, and in it is my contention, which I had said a couple of weeks ago, that I believe that some Black folks were also instrumental in having Black folks sent here to be put in bondage. And I correlate them with the drug dealers of today that have, a lot of them have sort of sold their own people into the slavery of addiction. Speaking of that, those of you that are Facebook friends of mine know that last week I posted a video recognizing my 25th year anniversary, Pastor Thomas. 25 years from abstaining, if you will, from alcohol, which I had a terrible history with it. 30 years of drinking, and I posted a 25-year anniversary post. Facebook that same day had hit me with a lot of memories of other posts that I made on March the 2nd throughout, I think, the past 5 years. And so I had an inclination to also share those. And the reason I did that, which I think caused some kind of confusion with some people, because there were people that were congratulating me on the ones from a year or two ago, or 3 years ago, 3 years back. Well, the reason I posted those was because I wanted to, something inside of me said that, there are doubting Thomases out there. And so I just wanted to show some proof. I'm the one that always say that you don't have to validate yourself to anyone. But I wanted to show that there was a progression, because I know that I had made a post on the 21st year anniversary and the 22nd and the 23rd and so on. And so I just hope that inspires some out there that are dealing with the pains of addiction, whether it be alcohol or any other drug. It's all unnatural, and it's not something that you were really created to have to be slaved to. And so, I freely will give advice to anyone that contacted me about how I did it, how I overcame it. And I give all credit and all praises to my Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ was who I prayed to on this most recent journey. It wasn't my first attempt to try to stop drinking, because, like I said, I tried many, many times. I cannot count the 40 ounces that I found myself in a room with, saying, I'm going to really savor this last quarter of the bottle, because this is going to be my last drink. It's going to be my last drink. I said that many, many times, many, many times. And then I fell. I fell down. I fell off the sobriety wagon. And I finally came to the realization of myself that what I was doing was helping the enemy destroy me. If you're caught up in that addiction, you're helping the enemy destroy you also. And you are destroying your liver, you are destroying your heart, your pancreas, and you're causing a whole lot of misery to a lot of folks in your family and friends, those that really care about you. You're bringing them unnecessary harm. And so, as I say, if I can encourage you in any kind of way to leave that stuff alone, and I tell you, the first thing I would suggest is that you tell yourself that you're not going to do it that day. You're not going to smoke a joint that day. You're not going to take a drink that day, or whatever. Now, don't worry about tomorrow. Tomorrow will take care of itself. Don't say I'm not going to have a drink for the rest of the week, because you don't want to put yourself under that kind of pressure. Just say, this day I'm not going to, this day, okay? And then the next day, if you're blessed with the next day, say that again and again and again. And I tell you, day by day, one day at a time, adds up. When you agree, Pastor Charlie?
Yes, sir. Agreed.
Yeah, one day at a time adds up. A lot of folks that you know of, that you think are doing well, if you could only look back in their past, you see that a lot of them have struggled with the same thing that you find yourself struggling with now. And they found a way to overcome it. And ain't nobody there like you. If I could do it, if someone else in this room can do it, then you can do it too. You gotta really, really want to. You gotta really, really want to. You gotta ask the Lord. You gotta turn it over to the Lord. Let the Lord know that you realize that it's something bigger than you, that you cannot handle alone. And the Lord will direct your steps to get the proper help that you need. Okay, just a moment. Say, wait a minute. It gets a call. Pardon me, folks. Hey, Chris, give me a little segue music here. This gets us calling, man.
Yo, check this out. Yo, we're gonna go back to the old school right now.
Yeah, we're on the air.
Hi, Harrisburg family and friends. My name is Crystal Davis, and I'm a Harrisburg resident, a veteran, and a business owner right here in the capital city. I am currently a city council candidate for the 2023 May 16th election. See you at the polls.
Okay, just a minute. Hey, Chris.
Yes, sir.
Say, do you have anything to read?
Oh, sure. These are fresh off the press, man. Black Business Directory.
Okay, all right. Here. Yo, this help?
Yeah, what's going on, man? It's your boy Q Life, Man Up Entertainment. We here with the real rap with Ron Chapel, right here on The Voice, 17104.com. Let's go.
This is Kiana Palmer, and you are listening to The Real Rap with Ron Chapel on The Voice at 17104.com, Mondays 8 till 10.
Okay, well, listen. Okay, the show is only 1 hour now. All right, okay. Well, okay, pardon me, folks. Thanks, Chris. They told me they ate a half a box of Raisin Bran. Half a box of Raisin Bran for lunch. And so now they're having a reaction, But we're going to try to bear with the folks. We only have a 1 hour show. And I'm pretty sure that we'll be able to introduce the guest to you, before this show is over. Okay, just a minute. What? You already seen this. This is all we got. I'm not gonna give you a Bible to take in there. No, you can't use my phone. No, you can't use, Chris.
Yes, sir.
They say, can they use your phone?
Or when they get out the restroom, sir, sure.
Okay. Chris said you can use his phone once you come out. Okay. I ain't taking my phone in there. Oh man, I gotta put my mask on now. Oh man. Okay, pardon us, folks. We have a guest that's having a little bit of a difficulty. And as soon as that, oh wow. Hey, close the door. Excuse me. Gotta close the door now. Now we can't talk to you while you're in here. Wow. Why would somebody eat a half a box of Raisin Bran during lunch, Pastor Thomas?
That's a good question, brother. Inquiring minds want to know.
Yeah, well, I tell you, nobody's coming on the show. I don't even know if they knew we had a bathroom down here.
Oh my, oh my.
Okay, well, give me a moment, man. I gotta catch my breath here. Wow. Say they was trying to lose weight, so they had half a box of Raisin Bran. But that's not how you do it, That's not how you do it. It takes some exercise. And cutting down on calories. All right, okay, let's see if I can bear with it. Now, speaking of that, y'all, you still got time, those of you that want to try to, that they want to slim and trim down for the summer, now's the time when you should put that plan into effect. Put that plan into effect right now. And it's not just eating a bunch of Raisin Bran, because, but anyway, you got to watch what you eat, true enough. But, I think you also got to incorporate some exercise, If you can't run, well, then walk. You can get up and just walk around the block, time to time, And if you're at work on lunch, don't be taking in a shopping bag full of lunch, sandwiches on top of sandwiches and cakes and pies and cookies, so during lunch, why not just go outside the building where we work at and walk around the parking lot? Just walk around the parking lot, so you be ready for the summer. Because the last thing you want to do during the summer months, if God give, and you don't want to be huffing and puffing your way through the summer, and you don't want to take your big sweaty self and plop it down on somebody's couch. Know what I'm saying, Pastor Tom?
Yes, sir, I agree, sir.
Or plopping down your sweaty, greasy self on somebody's chair. I can say it like that because it's true, You don't want to be plopping down, and they don't want you doing it either. You don't want to be embarrassed plopping yourself down on somebody's chair and break a chair leg or break the springs in that chair or break the springs in that couch. So like I say, now's the time that, for you to concentrate on cutting those calories and incorporating some exercise into your program and get yourself right. Because, you might want to wear some short pants. Know what I'm saying, Pastor Thomas? You might want to wear some short pants in the summer. And nothing don't look so good as, well, I'm not gonna say that because, when every time I write about something like this, people say, well, why are you body shaming? Why are you fat bashing? I'm not fat bashing. I was a fat kid. I was a fat kid till I was about 12. And this whole thing about fat and happy is one of the biggest lies in the world. Like Oprah said, she wasn't fat and happy, she was fat and miserable, especially on hot days, and so you got time now to get yourself into. Okay, just a minute, Pastor Thomas. Better put my mask on. Calling me again. Where's that spray at? You got a radio show going on. No, I don't have a light. You can't smoke that in here. This is a church. You can't smoke this stuff in here. Why would you bring something like that in here anyway? And the nerve of some people. And they're rolling something up, asking me if I got a light, Pastor Thomas.
What?
Yeah. Asking me if I got a light. Oh, it's probably the last time they'll be on this show. I let them come on Pastor Vincent show and get themselves right. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. All right, y'all. So, the guest is still not ready to come out. So what we're gonna do, we're gonna move right along. Where's that spray at? We're gonna move right along. And I spoke about the video of the North Atlantic slave trade, and I hope you learned something from this video. And let you know that there were a lot of different nations involved in what our people went through, the plight that we had to endure. Okay, you ready, Pastor Thomas?
Yes, sir.
Okay, well, we'll wait, I guess, to be finished, and okay.
Forms throughout the world. But one institution stands out for both its global scale and its lasting legacy.
Numbers involved in the Atlantic slave trade are truly staggering. From 1500 to 1880 CE, somewhere between 10 and 12 million African slaves were forcibly moved from Africa to the Americas, and about 15% of those people died during the journey.
The majority of enslaved Africans were taken from 6 primary regions: Senegambia, Sierra Leone and the Windward Coast, the Gold Coast, the Bight of Benin, the Bight of Biafra, and West Central Africa, also known as Congo and Angola. An estimated 12.4 million people were loaded onto slave ships and carried through what became known as the Middle Passage, which moved across the Atlantic and included many different destinations.
Once in the Americas, the surviving slaves were sold at a market very similar to the way cattle would be sold. After purchase, slave owners would often brand their new possession on the cheeks, again, just as they would do with cattle. The lives of slaves were dominated by work and terror.
The idea that I am not human, that I have no soul, that I'm a beast. Brand me, burn me, whatever, and no recourse, nothing.
The history of humanity is filled with oppression, dominance, war, and slavery. Since the beginning of time, people in different parts of the world have forced their fellow humans into slavery. The tale of the Atlantic slave trade is the history of millions of Africans who were forced out of their communities by European slave traders and shipped across the Atlantic in conditions of great cruelty. When Portugal and Spain started conquering and establishing colonies in the New World in the early 1500s, they forcefully made the Indians work their plantations. However, European diseases and the violence of conquest led to the death of many of the Indian slaves. This led to a labor shortage in Europe and made the Europeans look towards Africa, for a solution. As voyages to Africa progressed, and with many expeditions by Portuguese and Spanish explorers, Africa became a major source of supply of slaves to Europe. In the Spanish West Indies, as well as the Portuguese colonies in Brazil, the Indian slaves were gradually replaced by Africans. These Africans were stripped of their identity and occupation. To refer to them as just slaves is incorrect, because before being captured by the European, many of them were farmers, merchants, soldiers, musicians, goldsmiths, blacksmiths, and many more. They were husbands, fathers, wives, children, and mothers. They had origins and heritage, but when the Europeans came and took over their communities, they became captives and had to be boarded on large ships and taken to Europe. The European slavers dispersed them across the Americas and different parts of Europe. They were forced to lead lives under terrible conditions and face severe labor conditions. They were stripped and flogged and forced to work very long hours, often under terrible weather and health conditions. The transatlantic slave trade transported between 10 million and 12 million enslaved black Africans across the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. You might have heard of the triangular trade, right? And how Africa was a major part of this trade, although suffering economically, while the other two parts that made up the triangle enjoyed huge economic benefits. We'll get to that shortly. The first slave voyage from Africa to the Americas is believed to have sailed in 1526, but even before this period, Africans were bought as slaves directly from Europe, and even native inhabitants of America were also enslaved by European explorers. Before 1518, the Spanish monarchy didn't permit the transportation of African slaves from Africa, not due to a sense of moral value or humanity, but because they believed Africans were barbaric and that they would corrupt the European society and introduce pagan and non-Christian practices to the country. However, over the years, due to economic reasons, there was a U-turn in that decision, and on August 18, 1518, King Charles V granted a charter to Lorenzo de Gouravad to transport 4,000 slaves directly from Africa to the Spanish-American colonies. Over time, King Charles changed the law established by his grandparents and then permitted slaves to be brought into Spanish colonies in America from Africa on the condition that they would be converted to Christianity during their voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. With this new decree in place, there was an explosion in the number of slaves moved from Africa to America. There was an immediate expansion of the slave trade in the Western Hemisphere. European slave traders gathered and imprisoned the enslaved at forts on the African coast, and then brought them to the Americas. Generally, the European slave traders did not participate in the raids because their life expectancy in sub-Saharan Africa was less than a year due to the widespread malaria infection. So the majority of people that were transported in the transatlantic slave trade were people from Central and West Africa that were captured by other West Africans and sold to the Western European slave traders. The transatlantic slave trade was essential to the whole economics of the triangular trade route, and European colonies in America needed the supply of slaves for their plantations. Speaking of essential, it's essential for you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more content like this. They don't want us sharing stories like this, but we're going to continue anyway with your support. The triangular trade. Now, let's dive a little deeper into what the triangular trade route was all about. The triangular trade route is simply the trade structure that operated across the Atlantic region. This triangular trade route across the Atlantic took goods from Europe to Africa. Some of the goods taken to Africa include arms, textiles, and wine. On the other side of the triangle was the movement of African slaves to the Americas and the West Indies. The last side of the triangle was the movement of raw materials such as sugar, coffee, tobacco, rice, and cotton produced on American plantations back to Europe. The triangle involved 3 continents, with Europe providing the capital, Africa providing the labor, and America providing the land and resources. There was always a supply to the European market. The story of the transatlantic slave trade involves the story of all people in the 3 continents, but most importantly, those involved in the Middle Passage voyage. The trade route that transported slaves is known as the Middle Passage. The voyage is often marked with a lot of difficulties and even death. Depending on the weather, the voyage could take about 3 to 6 months. The passage was so brutal that the ships not only lost the people being transported as slaves, but in some cases, the crew also lost their lives. The mortality rate for sailors on slave ships was approximately 20%. The ships had a particular design and varied in size and passenger capacity. The conditions of these ships were inhumane. The African slaves were locked up below the deck in cramped quarters and only had a little opportunity to be out in the sunlight, and they were forced to carry out certain enforced exercises in the form of dancing to ensure that they were healthy and in good posture when they get to Europe. Inside of these decks was sticky and filled with the stench of dirt, feces, and urine. Research published in 1794 estimated that a man inside the deck had just a space of 6 feet by 1 foot 4 inches, and a woman had 5 feet by 1 foot 4 inches. The girls had 4 feet 6 inches by 1 foot. The air inside the deck was hot, stale, and filled with the incessant smell of dirt and human excreta. The slaves suffered from starvation and thirst, and only had 24 ounces of water every day, i.e. the equivalent of 2 12-ounce soda cans of fluid per day. Their major food was horse beans and rice. The captives were packed tightly in tiers below decks and were chained together, hands and feet. The voyage was characterized by many difficulties, and the captives were faced with issues that included epidemic diseases and attacks by pirates. They also experienced physical, sexual, and psychological abuse by slave traders and crewmen. An estimate by historians put it that between 15 and 25% of the enslaved Africans bound for the Americas died during this voyage. The conditions were so severe that only a tiny percentage of the Africans transported in the slave trade came directly to North America. Just about 4% of the total Africans transported, not more than 400,000, arrived in North America directly. A vast majority of the slaves were sent to the Caribbean and South America, and almost half of the slaves that were captured and transported out from Africa, totaling about 5 million, were sent to Brazil. I know you will be wondering how thousands of slaves couldn't overpower hundreds of crewmen. Well, there was one popular situation where African slave trades revolted and took over their ships. The detail of this story is as chilling as it is fascinating. We will get to that shortly, but keep in mind that the slave traders were armed and typically had the slaves in chains before transporting them. Anyways, let's finish up on the journey and the economics of the transatlantic slave trade. And while we may think that all slaves transported out of Africa were through the transatlantic route, that is not entirely true. The transatlantic slave only made up for half of the total slaves traded and transported out of Africa. It is reported that from AD 650 to 1900, Islamic traders were also exporting slaves out of Africa and sent out a total of 10 million slaves to Arabia, Yemen, Iran, India, and Iraq. The slaves were transported across the Sahara Desert, the Red Sea, and the Indian Ocean, while some slaves were also enslaved but remained in Africa. Many of the slaves captured and transported in the transatlantic slave trade were taken from the region bordering the Gulf of Guinea. The slave activities in this region were excessive, that the section of the African coast in countries like Togo, Benin, and Nigeria was even referred to as the Slave Coast. A majority of the slaves were taken from West Central Africa. In the early stages of the transatlantic slave trade, the Portuguese generally bought Africans who were captured as slaves during tribal wars. But as the demand for slaves increased, the Portuguese began to enter the interior of Africa to forcibly take captives. In the 1690s, the number of people taken out of Africa yearly reached about 30,000, and a century later, the number grew to about 85,000 per year. During the 1700 and 1850, it was estimated that more than 8 out of 10 Africans were forced into the slave trade, successfully crossed the Atlantic. In the period between 1821 and 1830, about 80,000 people were leaving Africa yearly, and within the next 20 years, before the abolition of slave trade, over 1 million more Africans were sent across the Atlantic to America. By 1820, almost 4 Africans for every 1 European had been transported across the Atlantic, and 4 out of 5 women who crossed the Atlantic were from Africa. The majority of enslaved Africans brought to British North America arrived between 1720 and 1780. The Africans who were sent to Brazil were mostly from Angola, and those who were transported to North America, including the Caribbean, were taken mainly from West Africa. Although just about 6% of African captives were sent to British North America in 1825. the US population included about 1/4 of the people of African descent in the Western Hemisphere. Interestingly, the condition of slavery in America was totally different from that in the US. But before we delve into these mind-boggling details, let's talk about the revolt of 1839. Remember, I mentioned this earlier. In 1839, slave traders were once again hoping to get another shipment of slaves across the Atlantic, but unlike previous voyages, they were not ready for the surprise this particular voyage would be bringing their way. The slave ship named Amistad had about 100 slaves on board. As the ship moved near the coast of Cuba, the unwilling passengers of the ship, who were recently abducted from Africa, numbering about 53, revolted aggressively. The revolters were led by Joseph Sink. They killed the captain and cook, and only spared the life of the Spanish navigator so that he can sail them home back to Sierra Leone. However, the navigator managed to sail the Amistad northward. 2 months later, the US Navy intercepted and seized the ship off Long Island, New York. The ship was towed to New London, Connecticut, and the mutineers were held in jail in New Haven, Connecticut. This event had significant political and legal repercussions in the American abolition movement. At that time, the Spanish embassy demanded that the African slaves are returned to Cuba, and this led to the 1840 trial in Hartford, Connecticut federal court. New England abolitionist Louis Tappan was successful in drawing public sympathy to the Africans and was able to battle it with the pro-slavery US government. However, the US president at the time, Martin Van Buren, ordered a Navy ship sent to Connecticut to return the Africans to Cuba immediately after the trial. The interesting part of this incident was the legal proceeding that ensued. The prosecutors argued that as slaves, the mutineers were subject to the laws governing conduct between slaves and their masters. And this is where it gets interesting. The trial testimony showed that while slavery was legal in Cuba, the importation of slaves from Africa was not. The judge therefore ruled that the Africans were not merchandise, but were victims of kidnapping, and so had the right to escape their captors in any way they could. When the US government appealed the case before the US Supreme Court, the following year, former President John Quincy Adams was able to win the court ruling in favor of the Amistad rebels. The Supreme Court upheld the judgment of the lower court through contributions from private and missionary societies. The 35 surviving Africans secured a passage home. They arrived in Sierra Leone in January 1842 alongside 5 missionaries and teachers who later founded a Christian mission in the country. While we could definitely blame the Europeans for the activities of the Atlantic slave trade, Africans were also involved in slave trade activities. Africans were involved in kidnapping adults and stealing children for the purpose of selling them. They used European intermediaries or agents to sell off these captives in exchange for merchandise or arms. In most cases, those sold into slavery were usually from a different ethnic group than those who captured them, and it didn't matter if they were enemies or indigenous of a neighboring village. The captive slaves were stripped of any identity they had and simply referred to as other. They were not seen as part of the people of the ethnic group or tribe. Also, while African kings were very much interested in protecting their villages, in some instances, thieves and criminals were sold out into slavery as a way to get rid of them. Many other slaves were gotten through raids at gunpoint, which were organized by different ethnic groups, and in some instances, as a joint venture with the Europeans. Also recorded in the book, Daughters of the Trade, Atlantic Slavers and Interracial Marriage on the Gold Coast, the author, Pernille Ibsen, shared that Africans on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana, also participated in the slave trade through intermarriage. The term used was casare, which gets its origins from Portuguese and means to marry. Casare was used to form political bonds and economic connections between the slave traders and the Europeans. In the initial stages of slave trade, it was common practice for the powerful West African families to marry off their women to the European traders in alliance and to further enforce the syndicate. While the marriages had to be performed based on African customs, the Europeans offered no objection as they were fully aware of how vital these connections were to the success of their businesses. In the initial stages, we may argue that Africans had no idea of the exact condition of the slave trade and the experience of those sold into the slave trade. However, according to Robin Law, there is a possibility that the royal elites of the Dahomey Kingdom must have had an informed understanding of the fates of the Africans sold into slavery. This is because the King of Dahomey sent diplomats to Brazil and Portugal who returned with information about their trips. Also, some of the elites of Dahomey had experienced slavery in America before returning home. So the only opposition the Kingdom of Dahomey had against slavery was the law that prohibited the enslavement of a fellow Dahomean. Anyone caught doing this faced the death penalty, and while the kingdom was against this, they had no issue with the institution of slavery. The case was different on the Gold Coast, which is present-day Ghana. Here, elites sent their kids to learn about the slave trade from the Europeans by sailing with them and living inside their forts. Some even sent their children to Europe and America to be educated. Elites on the Gold Coast also had agreements with the Dutch and British governments to rescue some of their friends who were tricked into slavery in America. However, a common assumption by many Africans who were not aware of the true purpose of the Atlantic slave trade was that the Europeans were cannibals who planned on cooking and eating their captives. This rumor even made it more distressing for the captives who were locked in ships sailing to Europe. The transatlantic slave trade led to an uncountable loss of lives for both captives in and outside America. A BBC report indicated that more than 1 million people are thought to have died during their transport to the New World. More died soon after their arrival due to terrible health conditions, although the number of slaves that died when bought as slaves is unclear. One thing we are sure of is that this number may exceed the number of those that survived to be enslaved. The Atlantic slave trade led to the destruction of lives and cultures. It is estimated that about 12 million slaves entered the Atlantic trade between the 16th and 19th centuries, and about 1.5 million died on board slave ships. And apart from those who died in the Middle Passage, it is also estimated that many Africans were killed during the slave raids and wars in Africa. Canadian scholar Adam Jones has characterized the deaths of millions of Africans in this period as a genocide. He referred to it as one of the worst holocausts in human history. Many believed that these deaths were not intentional and it was in the slave owners' interest to keep slaves alive and not exterminate them. Jones argues that the killing and destruction were intentional, whatever the incentives to preserve survivors of the Atlantic Passage for labor exploitation. To revisit the issue of intent already touched on, if an institution is deliberately maintained and expanded by discernible agents, though all are aware of the hecatombs of casualties it is inflicting on a definable human group, then why should this not qualify as genocide? Saidiya Hartman, an American writer and academic focusing on African American studies, argues that the deaths of enslaved people were incidental to the acquisition of profit and the rise of capitalism. She argues that death wasn't a goal of its own, but just a byproduct of commerce, which has the lasting effect of making negligible all the millions of lives lost. Incidental death occurs when life has no normative value, when no humans are involved, when the population is, in effect, seen as already dead. Saidiya Hartman goes on to say that although unlike the concentration camp or the Gulag, the Atlantic slave trade also led to the millions of corpses. In this case, extermination was not the major goal. It was a major corollary to the making of commodities. Who do we blame? While we could blame the Germans for the genocide attempt on the Jews, who do we blame for the slave trade? 7 nations were actively involved in the activities of the slave trade and took most of the slaves to their colonies in the New World. We have the Portuguese, the British, the French, the Spanish, the Dutch, the Americans, and the Danish. The major sources of slaves include Angola Coast, Bight of Benin, Bight of Biafra, Gold Coast, Senegambia, Southeast Africa, and Indian Ocean Islands, Sierra Leone, and Windward Coast. The presence of European slavers also affected how the legal code in Africa worked. According to Kamani Nahusi, many African societies changed the punishment for certain crimes and the way they responded to certain offenders. Some crimes, which were traditionally punishable by some other form of punishment, became punishable by enslavement, and offenders were now sold to slave traders. David Stannard, the author of American Holocaust, showed in his book that 50% of African deaths occurred in Africa as a result of wars between native kingdoms, which produced the majority of slaves. The practice of enslaving enemy combatants and their villages was widely practiced in West Africa. Indeed, the slave trade was largely a byproduct of tribal and state warfare. By selling off captives, they were also able to finance future warfare and also remove potential dissidents after victory. However, some of the African nations, such as Igala, Kabu, Bono State, Oyo, Ashanti, Dahomey, and the Oro Confederacy, were more brutal in this practice. Truly, Africans were fully involved in the slave trade and even aided it in many ways. But we can't take away the fact that the Europeans provided the incentives that made this activity thrive. In one of the letters written by Manicongo Nzinga Afonso to the King João III of Portugal, he writes to the king requesting that the king stop sending merchandise that is fueling the war between the different tribes. He begs the king to stop sending merchandise and rather send more missionaries. In one of his letters, he writes, "Each day the traders are kidnapping our people, children of this country, sons of our nobles and vassals, even people of our own family. This corruption and depravity are so widespread that our land is entirely depopulated. We need in this kingdom only priests and school teachers and no merchandise, unless it is wine and flour for mass. It is our wish that this kingdom is not a place for the trade or transport of slaves. Many of our subjects eagerly lust over Portuguese merchandise that your subjects have brought into our domains. To satisfy this inordinate appetite, they seize many of our black free subjects. They sell them, after having taken these prisoners to the coast, secretly or at night. As soon as the captives are in the hands of white men, they are branded with a red-hot iron." Despite the vast consequences of the transatlantic slave trade, there have been worldwide apologies from different nations that benefited and grew their economy based on labor from the slave trade. In 1998, UNESCO designated 23 August as International Day for the remembrance of the slave trade and its abolition. This led to several other events that recognized the adverse effects of slavery on the African continent. In 2001, during the World Conference Against Racism in Durban, South Africa, African nations demanded a clear apology for slavery from the former slave trading countries. Some nations were ready to express an apology. However, the opposing countries, majorly the United Kingdom, Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and the United States, blocked any attempt to do so. The reason for this opposition by these countries could be due to concerns that accepting their involvement in slavery would also require that they make monetary compensations to the affected African nations. Since 2009, there has been a continuous effort by the UN to create the UN Slavery Memorial as a permanent remembrance of the victims of the Atlantic slave trade. This video is crazy, but if you want to learn some more Black history that they never taught us in school, click the link in the screen. It's a story I'm sure you don't want to miss. We'll see you over there.
Okay. Thank you, Pastor Thomas. Now, so you see some of the history that brought us to this point of being in this country, and some say being here without a country. And I tell you, as I say, a lot of nations played a part in the gain from that bondage. And it also told that a lot of Black kingdoms in Africa also sold their own people into bondage. So it wasn't all just white folks. It wasn't all just white folks. No more than it's white folks that are in your neighborhoods robbing you and breaking into your houses and selling poison to your loved ones. You know, Black folks played a big part in this situation that we're in also. Okay, on another note, May the 8th is International Women's Day. International Women's Day. Now, it started May the 8th, 1857 in New York, where female textile workers were protesting the unbearable working conditions that they labored under. And so Women's Day, International Women's Day, March the 8th. So if you got a woman in your life, your mother, your grandmother, who you should honor all the time anyway, or it could be Miss Mary down the street, or it could be a sister in church that you see that seem to be unloved by her relatives, sometimes her own children. Do something nice for them. You know, give them a call. If you can afford, afford it, see if they'd like to go out for a bite to eat. See if you can take them out to lunch or take them out to dinner. or make plans, make arrangements to possibly pick them up and take them to church Sunday. Do something nice for somebody. Or you're going to the grocery store for yourself, or most of these grocery stores have a florist section where you can go in and purchase a nice flower or a plant for that woman in your life that might feel unappreciated. Okay. We owe so much to women, Pastor Thomas.
Sure.
We owe so much to the women. We all have or had mothers. Okay. And we all have or had grandmothers. And so we, any chance we get to show them just how important they are to us, how valuable they are to us in our lives, we should seize upon that time. We should seize upon that time. Some of you were raised by your grandmother, because some of you had wayward mothers for whatever reason. And some of you were orphans and you were raised by some other woman, or some other woman tended to your needs as far as clothing and as far as housing and as far as food. And so if you're in a position to show that appreciation, and I'm going to tell you, it don't have to be anything material or financial either. A phone call means so much. A phone call to an unsuspecting person, just to let them know that you were thinking about them, that you were concerned about them, that can really, really make somebody's day. And so, step away from that video game or those other things that are occupying all your time, and let somebody know just how important they are to you. And, there's some Women's Day concerts that are coming up here in the Harrisburg area. And there's some that extend beyond just this week. And we'll be telling you more about those in the future, in the near future, if God give. I know, for instance, Bethel AME Church has a Mother's Day concert planned, I believe, April the 21st. Not a Mother's Day concert, but a concert in honor of International Women's Day. It should not just be held to just one day, not just May the 8th. May the 8th is sort of like the flagship day. They have a Mother's Day concert, and so I keep saying Mother's Day, Pastor Thomas. An International Women's Day concert, an expression that they will be doing at the Bethel AME Church on, I believe the date is April the 21st. As I say, as time draws near, we'll be telling you more about it. We may even have members from Bethel AME Church here in Harrisburg, one of the oldest Afro-American churches in Harrisburg. And so we will hopefully have some members from that church on to tell you more about the very, very special concert that they will be hosting over at Bethel AME Church. Okay, y'all. Well, I hope that that video was worthwhile, and I think that could also be a teaching tool to those in your family that may not be aware of any of our history, and especially to your young children. To your young children, I think that's something that you might want to see that they sit up and watch also. Okay. And especially if you have a smart TV at home, I think you can show that video on that TV screen, on a large screen, Pastor Thomas.
Sure.
And so it's a worthwhile video, and it's worth your time. I'm sure you will agree. It's nothing like knowledge and information. Information is a very, 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 very powerful tool. And that video is something that you probably wouldn't see on a regular TV channel. And so, it's up to you to really spread the word about it and to see to it or try to see to it that others can also witness it, view it, and appreciate it and learn from it. Sometimes I think, Pastor Thomas, that the entire Afro-American race here in this country, Pastor Thomas, is probably suffering from a delayed post-traumatic stress disorder.
Okay.
Can you understand what I'm saying?
Okay.
When you consider the wicked things that happened in our past, the things that we had to deal with, the things that we had to overcome, And I'm not talking just hundreds and hundreds of years ago. We have to be concerned with things like how the system seems to devalue our lives, Pastor Thomas, devalue our lives and our well-being, constantly using us as cannon fodder in a lot of the wars in this country, wars for this country, rather, that are started by the so-called rich whose kids don't fight in them. You understand what I'm saying?
Sure.
They're good at starting wars, as long as they can send your son, your grandson, or your nephew to go fight in them. The same thing I was saying when Trump was president. It's a doggone shame that him being a 5-time draft dodger, being the commander-in-chief of the U.S. military forces, he had the authority, the legal authority, to send your loved one into harm's way. And you can bet your bottom dollar that his 2 grown rusty sons would never be over there fighting alongside your son. Matter of fact, or your nephew, or your grandson, or your cousin, because they would never even go. It'll be people like Trump and his cohorts that would profit off of that war. The same way it was back during Desert Storm, Pastor Thomas.
Sure.
When I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, George W. Bush was president, and with Dick Cheney being his vice president, and Dick Cheney, his company was feeding the troops overseas, Pastor Thomas, and this company was providing housing for the troops overseas. So every time they fight a war in this country, or this country gets involved in a war, the 1% of the nation profits from it, of the blood and sacrifice of your loved ones. Sometimes I have to question myself, Pastor Thomas.
Sure.
Why was I so eager to go off and serve? But they used to tell us back during my early years was this thing about communism, Pastor Thomas. You got to fight communism. You got to fight the communists. The communists going to come over and do this and do that. Well, a lot of folks came to some realization that a lot of things that folks were telling us that the communists would do, we were already dealing with, and sometimes in worse situations, And as a matter of fact, what they did not tell us was that communism wouldn't necessarily affect us as much as it would affect the people that were profiteering from the war. Pastor Thomas.
Okay.
Communism could not hurt some poor folks from the inner city as much as they can, as much as it would hurt some so-called rich folks, on the other side of the tracks. Matter of fact, they should have been the ones that were drafted to be sent over there. But all of them, most of them, just like Trump, had all kind of tractor farmers, him having 5 himself. Matter of fact, don't let me start talking about him because no one in his entire bloodline has ever served one day in the U.S. military. His grandfather was an immigrant. His father was a pimp and a crook, and he didn't serve. Trump didn't serve, and none of his children served. You cannot go in any Trump household and find a legitimate picture of a military veteran, Pastor Thomas. If you didn't serve, our best bet that you probably had an uncle that served.
Sure.
Or you had cousins, or perhaps nephews, or grandfather. All of us out there can say that. And some of us served ourselves directly. We participated, but you cannot find a legitimate picture of a military veteran in any Trump household. And here he was the president of the country. As I say again, it's a doggone shame that he had the authority to put your loved ones in harm's way, someplace that his would never, ever be. And so the program, okay, we're about to go off the air now. The program is drawing to a close. Let me go check on this guest one more time, Chris, because I told these people we had a special guest to introduce them to. Let me go on there and check. I better suit up, man.
Sure, it's been there a long time, almost an hour, bro.
Yeah. Take this lace off. I'm going in. Oh man. Okay, the show is almost over. Man, flush the toilet. God dog it, the show is almost over. Well, come on out so everybody can see you. Wait a minute, where you going? God dog it, ran right out the door. Didn't even flush the toilet. Oh, man. All kind of stuff in there on the floor. That's the last time we'll ask them on. Oh, man. Well, folks, sorry we can't show you that guest. They just ran right out the door. But anyway, we thank y'all for tuning in. We thank y'all for watching. And we hope to be back here again next Monday night. And Pastor Thomas.
Yes, sir.
Okay, before we close out, excuse me, how about playing those 2 drops again? One from Crystal and one from Anthony Harrell. Candidates for Harrisburg City Council.
This is Anthony Harrell, and you're listening to The Ron Chapel Show, beginning at 8 p.m. on Mondays from The Voice 17104.com.
Yo, check this out. Yo, we're gonna go back to the old school right now.
Hi, this is Crystal Davis, and you are listening to the Ron Chapel Show at The Voice 17104.com every Monday night beginning at 8 p.m.
Okay, all right, y'all, and good night. Stay safe. Good night. Didn't even flush the toilet.